It's comical that you, of all people, should ask my views about prayer as worship or adoration. On this subject, you yourself taught me nearly all I know, on a walk in the forest of Dean. Can you have forgotten? You first taught me the great principle, begin where you are. I had thought one had to start by summoning up what we believe about the goodness and greatness of God, by thinking about creation and redemption and all the blessings of this life. You turned to the brook and once more splashed your burning face and hands in the little waterfall and said, "Why not begin with this?" And it worked. Apparently you have never guessed how much. That cushiony moss, that coldness and sound and dancing light were no doubt very minor blessings compared with the means of grace and the hope of glory. But then they were manifest. So far as they were concerned, sight had replaced faith. They were not the hope of glory. They were an exposition of the glory itself. Yet you were not, or so it seemed to me, telling me that nature, or the beauties of nature, manifest the glory. No such abstraction as nature comes into it. I was learning the far more secret doctrine that pleasures are shafts of the glory as it strikes our sensibility. As it impinges on our will or our understanding, we give it different names, goodness or truth or the like. But its flash upon our senses and mood is pleasure. But aren't there bad, unlawful pleasures? Certainly there are. But in calling them bad pleasures, I take it we are using a kind of shorthand. We mean pleasures snatched by unlawful acts. It is the stealing of the apple that is bad, not the sweetness. The sweetness is still a beam from the glory. That does not palliate the stealing. It makes it worse. There is sacrilege in the theft. We have abused a holy thing. I have tried since that moment to make every pleasure into a channel of adoration. I don't mean simply by giving thanks for it. One must of course give thanks, but I mean something different. How shall I put it? You can't, or I can't, hear the song of a bird. Simply the sound, its meaning or message, that's a bird, comes with it inevitably, just as one can't see a familiar word in print as a merely visual pattern. The reading is as involuntary as the seeing. When the wind roars, I don't just hear the roar, I hear the wind. In the same way, it is possible to read as well as to have a pleasure, or not even as well as. The distinction ought to become, and sometimes is, impossible. To receive it and to recognize its divine source are a single experience. This heavenly fruit is instantly redolent of the orchard where it grew. This sweet air whispers of the country from whence it blows. It is a message. We know we are being touched by a finger of that right hand, at which there are pleasures forevermore. There need be no question of thanks or praise as a separate event, something done afterwards. To experience the tiny theophany is itself to adore. Gratitude exclaims very properly, "How good of God to give me this." Adoration says, "What must be the quality of that being whose far-off and momentary coruscations are like this?" One's mind runs back up the sunbeam to the sun. If I could always be what I aim at being, no pleasure would be too ordinary or too usual for such reception. From the first taste of the air when I look out of the window, one's whole cheek becomes a sort of palate, down to one's soft slippers at bedtime. I don't always achieve it. One obstacle is inattention. Another is the wrong kind of attention. One could, if one practiced, hear simply a roar and not the roaring of the wind. In the same way, only far too easily, one can concentrate on the pleasure as an event in one's own nervous system, subjectify it, and ignore the smell of deity that hangs about it. A third obstacle is greed. Instead of saying, "This also is thou," one may say the fatal word encore. There is also conceit, the dangerous reflection that not everyone can find God in a plain slice of bread and butter, or that others would condemn as simply grey the sky in which I am delightedly observing such delicacies of pearl and dove and silver. You notice that I am drawing no distinction between sensuous and aesthetic pleasures. But why should I? The line is almost impossible to draw. And what use would it be if one succeeded in drawing it? If this is hedonism, it is also a somewhat arduous discipline. But it is worth some labor. For insofar as it succeeds, almost every day furnishes us with, so to speak, bearings on the bright blur. It becomes brighter but less blurry. William Law remarks that people are merely amusing themselves by asking for the patience which a famine or a persecution would call for, if, in the meantime, the weather and every other inconvenience sets them grumbling. One must learn to walk before one can run. So here, we, or at least I, shall not be able to adore God on the highest occasions if we have learned no habit of doing so on the lowest. At best, our faith and reason will tell us that he is adorable, but we shall not have found him so, not have tasted and seen. Any patch of sunlight in a wood will show you something about the sun, which you could never get from reading books on astronomy. These pure and spontaneous pleasures are patches of godlight in the woods of our experience. Of course, one wants the books too. One wants a great many things besides this adoration in infinitesimals, which I am preaching. And if I were preaching it in public, instead of feeding it back to the very man who taught it me, though he may by now find the lesson nearly unrecognizable, I should have to pack it in ice, enclose it in barbed wire reservations, and stick up warning notices in every direction. Don't imagine I am forgetting that the simplest act of mere obedience is worship of a far more important sort than what I've been describing. To obey is better than sacrifice. Or that God, besides being the great creator, is the tragic redeemer. Perhaps the tragic creator too. For I am not sure that the great canyon of anguish which lies across our lives is solely due to some prehistoric catastrophe. Something tragic may, as I think I've said before, be inherent in the very act of creation, so that one sometimes wonders why God thinks the game worth the candle. But then we share, in some degree, the cost of the candle and have not yet seen the game. There, I've done it again. I know that my tendency to use images like play and dance for the highest things is a stumbling block to you. You don't, I admit, accuse it of profanity as you used to, like the night we nearly came to blows at Edinburgh. You now much more reasonably call it heartless. You feel it a brutal mockery of every martyr and every slave, that a world process which is so desperately serious to the actors should at whatever celestial apex be seen in terms of frivolities. And you add that it comes with a ludicrously ill grace from me, who never enjoyed any game and can dance no better than a centipede with wooden legs. But I still think you don't see the real point. I do not think that the life of heaven bears any analogy to play or dance in respect of frivolity. I do think that while we are in this valley of tears, cursed with labor, hemmed round with necessities, tripped up with frustrations, doomed to perpetual plannings, puzzlings and anxieties, certain qualities that must belong to the celestial condition have no chance to get through. can project no image of themselves except in activities which, for us here and now, are frivolous. For surely we must suppose the life of the blessed to be an end in itself, indeed the end, to be utterly spontaneous, to be the complete reconciliation of boundless freedom with order, with the most delicately adjusted, supple, intricate, and beautiful order. How can you find any image of this in the serious activities, either of our natural or of our present spiritual life, either in our precarious and heartbroken affections, or in the way which is always in some degree a via crucis? No, Malcolm. It is only in our hours off, only in our moments of permitted festivity, that we find an analogy. Dance and game are frivolous, unimportant down here, for down here is not their natural place. Here, they are a moment's rest from the life we were placed here to live. But in this world, everything is upside down. That which, if it could be prolonged here, would be a truancy, is likest that which in a better country is the end of ends. Joy is the serious business of heaven. I plead guilty. When I was writing about pleasures last week, I had quite forgotten about the mala mentis gaudia, the pleasures of the mind which are intrinsically evil. The pleasure, say, of having a grievance. What a disappointment it is for one self-revealing moment to discover that the other party was not really to blame, and how a resentment, while it lasts, draws one back and back to nurse and fondle and encourage it. It behaves just like a lust. But I don't think this leaves my theory and experience of ordinary pleasures in ruins. Aren't these intrinsically vicious pleasures, as Plato said, mixed? To use his own image, given the itch, one wants to scratch it. And if you abstain, the temptation is very severe. And if you scratch, there is a sort of pleasure in the momentary and deceptive relief. But one didn't want to itch. The scratch is not a pleasure simply, but only by comparison with the conscience. In the same way, resentment is pleasant only as a relief from, or alternative to, humiliation. I still think that those experiences which are pleasures in their own right can all be regarded as I suggest. The mere mention of the horrible pleasures, the dainties of hell, very naturally led you away from the subject of adoration to that of repentance. I'm going to follow you into your digression, for you said something I disagreed with. I admit, of course, that penitential prayers, acts of penitence, as I believe they are called, can be on very different levels. At the lowest, what you call pagan penitence, there is simply the attempt to placate a supposedly angry power. I'm sorry, I won't do it again. Let me off this time. At the highest level, you say, the attempt is rather to restore an infinitely valued and vulnerable personal relation, which has been shattered by an action of one's own. And if forgiveness, in the crude sense of remission of penalty, comes in, this is valued chiefly as a symptom or seal, or even byproduct of the reconciliation. I expect you are right about that. I say expect, because I can't claim to know much by experience about the highest level either of penitence or of anything else. The ceiling, if there is one, is a long way off. All the same, there's a difference between us. I can't agree to call your lowest level pagan penitence. Doesn't your description cover a great deal of Old Testament penitence? Look at the Psalms. Doesn't it cover a good deal of Christian penitence? A good deal that is embodied in Christian liturgies? Neither take thou vengeance for our sins. Be not angry with us forever. Neque secundum iniquitates nostras retribuas nobis. Here, as nearly always, what we regard as crude and low, and what presumably is in fact lowest, spreads far further up the Christian life than we like to admit. And do we find anywhere in Scripture or in the Fathers that explicit and resounding rejection of it, which would be so welcome? I fully grant you that wrath can be attributed to God only by an analogy. The situation of the penitent before God isn't, but is somehow like that of one appearing before a justly angered sovereign, lover, father, master, or teacher. But what more can we know about it than just this likeness? Trying to get in behind the analogy, you go further and fare worse. You suggest that what is traditionally regarded as our experience of God's anger would be more helpfully regarded as what inevitably happens to us if we behave inappropriately towards a reality of immense power. As you say, the live wire doesn't feel angry with us, but if we blunder against it, we get a shock. My dear Malcolm, what do you suppose you have gained by substituting the image of a live wire for that of angered majesty? You have shut us all up in despair, for the angry can forgive and electricity can't. And you give as your reason that even by analogy, the sort of pardon which arises because a fit of temper is spent cannot worthily be attributed to God, nor gratefully accepted by man. But the belittling words fit of temper are your own choice. Think of the fullest reconciliation between mortals. Is cool disapproval coolly assuaged? Is the culprit let down lightly in a view of extenuating circumstances? Was peace restored by a moral lecture? Was the offense said not to matter? Was it hushed up or passed over? Blake knew better. I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath. My wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I hid my wrath. My wrath did grow. You too know better. Anger, no peevish fit of temper, but just generous, scalding indignation, passes, not necessarily at once, into embracing, exultant, re-welcoming love. That is how friends and lovers are truly reconciled. Hot wrath, hot love. Such anger is the fluid that love bleeds when you cut it. The angers, not the measured remonstrances of lovers, are love's renewal. Wrath and pardon are both, as applied to God, analogies. But they belong together to the same circle of analogy, the circle of life and love and deeply personal relationships. All the liberalizing and civilizing analogies only lead us astray. Turn God's wrath into mere enlightened disapproval, and you also turn his love into mere humanitarianism. The consuming fire and the perfect beauty both vanish. We have instead a judicious headmistress or a conscientious magistrate. It comes of being high-minded. I know that the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. That is not because wrath is wrath, but because man is fallen man. But perhaps I've already said too much. All that any imagery can do is to facilitate, or at least not to impede, man's act of penitence and reception of pardon. We cannot see the matter from God's side. The crude picture of penitence as something like apology or even placation has, for me, the value of making penitence an act. The more high-minded views involve some danger of regarding it simply as a state of feeling. Do you agree that this would be unwholesome? The question is before my mind at present because I've been reading Alexander White. Morris lent him to me. He was a Presbyterian divine of the last century, whom I'd never heard of. Very well worth reading. and strangely broad-minded, Dante, Pascal, and even Newman are among his heroes. But I mention him at the moment for a different reason. He brought me violently face to face with a characteristic of Puritanism, which I had almost forgotten. For him, one essential symptom of the regenerate life is a permanent and permanently horrified perception of one's natural and, it seems, unalterable corruption. The true Christian's nostril is to be continually attentive to the inner cesspool. I knew that the experience was a regular feature of the old conversion stories, as in grace abounding, but my inward and original corruption, that I had the guilt of to amazement. I was more loathsome in mine own eyes than was a toad. Sin and corruption, I said, would as naturally bubble out of my heart as water would bubble out of a fountain. Another author, quoted in Haller's Rise of Puritanism, says that when he looked into his heart, it was as if I had, in the heat of summer, looked down into the filth of a dungeon, where I discerned millions of crawling living things in the midst of that sink and liquid corruption. I won't listen to those who describe that vision as merely pathological. I have seen the slimy things that crawled with legs in my own dungeon. I thought the glimpse taught me sense, but White seems to think it should be not a glimpse, but a daily, lifelong scrutiny. Can he be right? It sounds so very unlike the New Testament fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, and very unlike the Pauline program, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forth unto those things that are before. And very unlike St. François de Sales' green, dewy chapter on la douceur towards oneself. Anyway, what's the use of laying down a program of permanent emotions? They can be permanent only by being factitious. What do you think? I know that a spiritual emetic at the right moment may be needed, but not a regular diet of emetics. If one survived, one would develop a tolerance of them. This poring over the sink might breed its own perverse pride over just and self-displeased. For self-offense more than for God offended. Anyway, in solitude and also in confession, I have found, to my regret, that the degrees of shame and disgust which I actually feel at my own sins do not at all correspond to what my reason tells me about their comparative gravity. Just as the degree to which in daily life I feel the emotion of fear has very little to do with my rational judgment of the danger. I'd sooner have really nasty seas when I'm in an open boat than look down in perfect actual safety from the edge of a cliff. Similarly, I have confessed ghastly uncharities with less reluctance than small unmentionables, or those sins which happen to be ungentlemanly as well as unchristian. Our emotional reactions to our own behavior are of limited ethical significance.